So back to the Beatitudes. We're just going to do a really quick review because at the end we'll do kind of a review then. So last week we talked about the blessings for the poor and those who mourn and those who are meek and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness and for those who show mercy. And so that leaves three more for us to go through today. Well, two or three depending on how you count them. We'll get to that when we get to it. So the first one is the pure in heart. And it says, blessed are those who are pure in their hearts, for they shall see God. And this is probably the hardest beatitude to see the connection between the present situation and the future blessing. Remember, that's what we've been looking at. These is they all consist of a present situation, people who are in a certain situation and what their blessing will be that kind of resolves that situation. And it's a present situation and a future blessing in all of these. And this is the one where it's really the hardest to see. But with a little thought, we can understand that people who are pure in their hearts are pure in their hearts because they have the image of God in them, God who is pure himself. And so with that image in you, you are also pure in heart. God makes us pure in heart. And pure means nothing else mixed in. So it's only God in our hearts and nothing else is in our hearts. And so once we have that, the future reward is to actually see all the purity that is God. And so what this is saying is those who are pure in their hearts now will see the purity of God in the future. I hope that makes some sense. So, but a lot of these Beatitudes are really talking about a worldly situation, and we'll kind of close by talking about that. And in this world, it is difficult to do a lot of the things that these Beatitudes are giving blessings for. And this is one of those. It's difficult in our life in this world to remain pure in our hearts. The world desires to feed us all kinds of impurities and teach us impure thoughts and get us to do wrong things. And so we're kind of similar that way to the other beatitude, which is the hungering and thirsting for righteousness. That hungering and thirsting for righteousness is something that we talked about, is something that will exist in us all the time that we are in this, because we live among a people who are not righteous. And so we continue to hunger and thirst for righteousness that we do not yet have, but will have in the future. And so it's really quite similar here for the pure in heart. They are pure in heart now, but what they really want is to see God and to be with God in that purity of heart. Next one is the peacemakers. And it says, blessed are they who make peace, for they will be called the children of God. Um, and so I think this one is pretty obvious. There's lots of Bible references about peace for Christians, and part of the way we live is a peaceful life. And that is because our God is a peaceful God. He desires to have peace. And therefore his children, whom he has taught in his ways and who are following in his ways, are also peaceful people. And that should be our nature in all the things that we do. And so that means that we would want to make peace wherever possible in the present. And when we do make peace in the present, we show that we are his children. So we are, by doing that, by making peace now, we show that we are the children of a peaceful God. And in the future it says, the people who make peace now will be called the children of God because the children of God are peaceful. So that's the peacemakers end of it. But peace depends on more than one person, especially in this world. You can't always have peace. And this is the world without peace. There's fighting and all sorts of things going on all the time, disagreements. And so peace in our own lives can be a difficult thing to achieve, as much as we might want to have it. And sometimes, as strange as it might seem, peace can only be achieved by a war. And that's the only way to resolve a situation. And sometimes it can only be achieved by refusing to engage in a fight of whatever is being offered. So peace in our time is a difficult thing and sometimes a strange thing to achieve. And the Bible actually gives us examples of both of those situations where God says, send out Israel to conquer these people because these people are going to keep on attacking. And also there are cases where the thing to do is just not to engage with these people and to leave them alone. And so again, peacemaking in this time is a difficult thing. And so the call to peacemaking here is not a call to pacifism or to rejection of war. It's a call, as Romans says, if it is possible, according to what is within you, make peace with every person. And so what Romans 12:18 is saying is do your very best. In this world, you can't always make peace with every person. Sometimes it's just not going to be like that. But do whatever, according to whatever your abilities are, do whatever you can to make peace with every person. But we live in a world where peace isn't something you can always achieve because peace takes more than one person to achieve it. And so once again, we see this idea of us living in a world where it's difficult because the world makes it difficult to be a peacemaker. It isn't an easy thing to do. It's something that many times we're at odds with people for reasons that are kind of out of our control. And we don't know how to make it any better. We would like to, but there just doesn't seem to be a way to make it any better than it is. So a lot of these Beatitudes are like that. This is the world that we live in, and we can't make it any better, but we have to deal with it, and we deal with it according to what the Bible says. So the next Beatitude talks about the persecuted, and it says, "Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the cause of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So to understand this one better, we have to understand what a persecuted person is. What does that mean to be persecuted? And a persecuted person is someone who is not wanted where he is because of who he is. And so if you can think of somebody that the world persecutes, you can tell right away that there's something different about that person. He's not like the people who are mistreating him. He is different from them in some way that's important to them, and therefore they persecute him for that. And so a persecuted person is a person who's not wanted where he is, and that's because of who he is. There's something different about him. And we understand that in spiritual terms, we are different from the world in very obvious ways in the way that we live, but also in spiritual terms, we're different from the world too. And persecution is a natural thing for Christians, although we in this country aren't experiencing that right now. So this beatitude offers there. It says theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and that seems to be the same reward that is mentioned for the poor. If you remember, it said, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So those two end the same in both cases. But in the first case, in the case of the poor were offered the wealth of the kingdom, and we dug into that to understand. And we looked at Luke's version of it to actually give us a better understanding of what exactly was meant by the kingdom of heaven. And so Luke talks about it being the wealth, the spiritual wealth of the kingdom, the future kingdom of heaven. And so here it's a little different from that. Although it says kingdom of heaven, it's offering exactly what a persecuted person doesn't have. And a persecuted person doesn't have a place where they are wanted. They aren't wanted because of who they are. And what you get from the kingdom of heaven in the future is a place where you are wanted, and a place where you're free from persecution and even free from the fear of persecution. And so what a blessing that would be to a persecuted person to be able to know in the future, despite the persecution you're going through now, there is a place, there is a future where you will have a place where you are wanted, even though you aren't wanted in the place where you are now. So this beatitude has something that the other beatitudes don't have, except for one other, the next one. So this beatitude has a conditional clause attached to it, and it says, I probably should have reproduced that verse here, but the blessing will only be received if you are being persecuted because you have acted for the cause of righteousness. Okay, so if you living a righteous life, then and that's the cause of your persecution, then yes, the blessing applies to you. But the blessing will not be yours if you're not living a righteous life, or if you're living according to your own definition of righteousness, but it's not God's righteousness. And so there's a conditional clause on that. If you're being persecuted because you're living the righteous life that God wants you to live, then the blessing is yours, but only in that case. And we can probably think of people who live bad lives. I have neighbors up the street here who are lawless people, and they aren't living a righteous life by any means. And if when whatever comes their way, that would not be the kind of thing that is being talked about in this beatitude. Okay, now the last one here is strange. And I've highlighted some bits in it that make it different from all the others, and we'll talk about that. So this is Matthew 5:11 and 12. So it's longer than all the others. That's another difference that you see right away. And it says, blessed are you whenever they revile you and persecute you, and they say every evil word against you for my sake in falsehood. Then rejoice and triumph, because your reward is great in heaven, for just so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So in addition to the length, this is different. It's not a beatitude. At least it's not a separate beatitude. I'll explain that in just a moment. Um, it doesn't specify a specific situation like all the others were. It doesn't say, blessed are the poor in spirit. It doesn't say, blessed are those who mourn. It says, blessed are you whenever they revile you, persecute you, say evil against you for my sake in falsehood. And so it doesn't have a real specific situation that it's talking about. It's talking about a bunch of different situations. And it also says you. In all the others, it didn't say you. It just says, blessed are the poor, or blessed are those who mourn. And so it uses you repeatedly in here. And it also says, it doesn't have a specific reward that is going to be there. It says your reward will be great, but it doesn't have a specific reward that it mentions. So it's different from all the others. It starts the same as the others, and so it's easy to think, yeah, this is just another beatitude. But when you really look at it, it doesn't have a lot in common with the other beatitudes. But it's definitely connected. It starts that same way, and it looks the same way. It has a lot of the same characteristics. So it's got to be connected to the beatitudes, but it's something a little different here. And one thing that it does is it repeats the word persecute from the previous beatitude. And so maybe this is just an extension of the previous beatitude, which was the one are blessed who are persecuted. Um, but I don't think that's the case here because of the word you in there especially. I think that this is a summary of the previous beatitudes, and it's been tuned for the disciples. Remember, that's who Jesus is speaking to with this message. These are his disciples, and the crowd isn't around him right now. And so when he says you, he's speaking to his disciples and obviously speaking to us as well, because here we are reading these words. Um, so it seems like a summary to me rather than an extension of the previous persecution beatitude, but you could read it either way. And so what if it's a summary, then what he's really saying here is all of these things, all of these beatitudes, this will be your life. And it hasn't been the life of Jews in the past. It hasn't been the life of any other Bible people in the past. Because the Jews have always had their own country to live in, and they wouldn't persecute each other that way normally. And so Jesus seems to be saying to his disciples, these things that I've described, these beatitudes, this will be your life. All of those situations will be characteristic of things that will happen to you in your life. But don't worry about those things. They're just earthly things. And remember, we talked about this whole Sermon on the Mount is about the present situation and the future spiritual situation. And so physical versus spiritual is a big part of this message as well as the whole Sermon on the Mount. So he's saying, don't worry about these physical things. These will happen to you, expect them, but there's a great reward in the future. Don't be caught up in the idea that because bad things are happening to you that somehow you're off the track. These things you should expect to happen to you because of the world that you live in. And don't worry about it. There's a great reward coming in the future for you. And so this you beatitude also has conditions. It has two of them. The first one is, it says, for my sake. And so with that, Jesus is saying, if you're mistreated because you're doing my work, if you're persecuted because you're doing my work, you are earning a reward in heaven. Okay? So there's that condition. If it's for my sake, if you're doing this work that you're being persecuted for my sake, then the blessing applies. And the second condition is in falsehood. And the Beatitude talked about if people say things that are false about you. And so with that, Jesus is saying, if they say evil about you and they're speaking the truth, well, then that's on you. There's no blessing for that. But if the things that they say about you concerning my sake are false, then yes, the blessing applies. And there's another thing that's kind of hidden in that blessing, if you think of it, or hidden in that condition, if you think about it. It says, in that first condition, it says, for my sake. Okay, so what that really is, when you look at it, is it's a claim to godhood. He's saying, I am God, because if he's saying, if you do what I say, God will reward you. Well, who can say that except for God? No man or any prophet could ever say that things. And so it's a hint, if you're looking carefully or listening carefully as a listener, that he is saying, I'm not just anybody saying these things, I am God. So we're done the Beatitudes now, and we'll just kind of go through some takeaways and some summary, and then we'll be done with it and move on. So what we saw from the very beginning was the idea that poor in spirit, and the idea that we finally got to after spending an entire lesson on it pretty much, was that the phrase in the spirit should really be by the spirit. And so it would say, blessed are the poor by the spirit. And once you make that change, then everything else makes sense. All of the Beatitudes make sense, and you don't have to go twisting them around into little pretzels. And and that fixes everything. Just that one translation change, and it's a valid translation change. It's a perfectly valid way to do it, but nobody does it that way. Well, one translation does it that way. Um, and so what we also saw was the paraphrase translations were really taking this offline, and they had really taken this. We talked about this interpretation that has been developed over time, and they inject the interpretation right into the paraphrase text. So you always need to be careful when you're looking at a paraphrase translations. It's been a long time since I talked about translations. I think it was back at NHU that I last did that. So maybe it's time to go through that again and look and understand what different translations are about and how they're done. But the paraphrase translations are one that allows the author an awful lot of latitude for what he puts in there. And other translation types don't allow the translator to do that. So that's another thing that we saw is you need to be very careful with paraphrase translations. And another thing that I discussed is your teacher should be Jesus. Just despite the people like me who are talking to you, you always need to be listening to the Spirit. Is this person saying what's right? Is this godly? Is this the thing that should be? And understand that despite much study and many followers, there are people who can be a way off, and they think that they understand the Bible, but they're just wrong on that. And we know for sure through prophecy that that's going to be the future. There's going to be all sorts of people teaching all sorts of false things that are deadly things to believe in, and they will be people who look like they are authorities and they claim authority. So you always need to be careful that your ultimate teacher is Jesus. So things to pick out of the text of the Beatitudes. There were three things that I found that were really interesting as I went through them, things that I hadn't thought about before or thought of in that way. And one of them is that living in this world, we should see reasons to mourn. That should be our experience of living in the world, is we see things that would cause us to mourn, to be sad about the situations that we see, things that we see going on. For example, we should be mourning for those who could perish without hearing the gospel. It should be a concern of ours to do whatever God wants us to do for those people who are in our sphere of influence, to make sure they hear the gospel message and see the gospel through us and how we live our lives. And similarly, we should be mournful for those who are suffering in a cruel world. This world that we've already talked about that is cruel to believers is also cruel to unbelievers. And there are lots of people who suffer in it for that. So we should always have a heart to be concerned for those people. And we should be mournful for a society that lies and steals and hates, but they won't turn to God because they're quite certain that this is just a normal way to live a life, and that somehow that makes sense to them. Nobody seems to ever say, this can't be the way life should be. Maybe God has the answer. There are so few people who take that route. And there are lots of other reasons that we should be able to look at the world and mourn for what we see going on and for the people that are influenced by it. And another thing was mercy is more than we usually think, and I hadn't realized this myself. It isn't just showing mercy to somebody who has done something wrong to you. It is helping anyone who needs the help that we are able to give. And so if someone needs help and we are the person who is able to give them help, then that's the mercy we need to show. And it isn't because they did something to us. They're just in a situation where they need someone's mercy. And this, in this world that we're talking about here, it produces lots of people who need mercy. They've done things mistakenly, who knows what happened, and now they're in a bad situation and they need help. And so we should always be ready to offer that help in whatever way is right for them, guided by the Holy Spirit, of course. And another thing I wanted to bring up was the idea of being pure in heart. being pure in heart is having the image of God who is pure within us. So if we have that image of God, yes, we're made in the image of God, but the purity of our heart is something that we can lose. And if our heart is pure, meaning that it has that image of God within us, then we're going to want to live according to that image of God that is within us. And so being pure and continuing to be pure is how we live our life. And that kind of goes back to the other Beatitudes that we talked about, is that we live our lives according to that image, but it isn't an easy thing to do in this world. And the world will just naturally, by its nature, try to corrupt the pure heart that we have and turn us into an evil-hearted people, a hard-hearted people. And we should be careful always to make sure that that doesn't happen. So I have a little bit of a Beatitude summary here and then a last point. So in the Beatitudes, what we see is what I'm calling 7 Beatitudes and an extra bit at the bottom here. Let me get my pointer out. There we are. Okay. And so what we saw was these present physical situations, and each of them had a future spiritual blessing. And so the first one was being pure, and we understand that one. And mourning, and we were just talking about that one. And hungering and thirsting for righteousness, we talked about that. In an unrighteous world, you're going to be feeling that hunger and thirsting always because you experience all of the unrighteousness around you. It's just going to be something that's going to continue on. And the blessing for that one is you will be satisfied. Finally, the hungering and thirsting that you have now will be satisfied where it can't be satisfied now. The Beatitude about mercy was being merciful in a merciless world. In this world, there is very little mercy shown to other people. And so the future spiritual blessing that we receive is that we will receive mercy, and all of God's people will receive mercy. We were just talking about pure in heart. And that pure in heart is living in an impure world and maintaining that pure heart. And the blessing of that is that we will see God, who is the pure one, who is the one that we've been modeling ourselves after. He's the one who's been the purity in our heart, guiding us to live a pure life. And we will finally see God and see all of what he is. And then there was the one about the Beatitude about being a peacemaker, and that was in a world without peace. And it says that we will be called the children of God, who is a peaceful God. And so in these 4, what we see is the idea always of living the righteous life, living correctly in the world, in an unrighteous world, or in a merciless world, or in an impure world, or a world without peace. And so that's just part of our situation in this reality. It's going to be that way. We're going to live among people who are not God's people, and we will have to try to maintain the hunger and thirsting for righteousness. We need to be merciful. We need to be pure in heart. We need to be peacemakers whenever it's possible. And that's just the life that we're going to live. And the expectation is, and the promise is really, that all of these things will be sorted out. We will receive the righteousness, we will receive mercy. We'll be satisfied in our hunger and thirsting. We'll see God. We'll be called the children of God, the peaceful God. And so all of those are just part of the reality that we live in and living in that. And the last one was persecuted for righteousness. And so we talked about a persecuted person being someone who doesn't belong and isn't wanted where he is. And so what we saw is the kingdom of heaven is going to be a place where you belong, and there won't be anybody who's persecuting you anymore. And then we saw the last thing that looked kind of like a blessing, but it wasn't a real beatitude. And it said, "Blessed are you whenever they revile you and persecute you, and they say every evil word against you for my sake in falsehood. Then rejoice and triumph, because your reward is great in heaven, for just so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And so what we see here particularly that I wanted to point out is the rejoicing and triumphing. In this world, which is so unrighteous, merciless, impure, and without peace, it's hard to rejoice and triumph when those kind of things fall on you or when you're even seeing them happen. But that's something that we should understand because we live in that knowledge of this future spiritual blessing that will come to us in time. And so when people are persecuting us, we should be rejoicing and triumphant and saying, yes, because of this, I am earning a great reward in the future. And so one last slide, a summary of all of this. So when we take all of these Beatitudes together, the message that we see in them is that these situations are just normal situations in the physical world. This is just how things are going to always be. There are going to be poor people. There are going to be people who are mourning. We should just expect that. One of the other Beatitudes said to show mercy. So if we see other people who are poor or mourning and it's not us, we should be willing to help them, to show mercy to them. But this is also true of other people, the unbelievers in the world, that they wind up being poor and they're mourning over deaths or whatever, and they need the mercy that we can offer them, whatever help we can offer them as well. And also the Beatitudes were saying things like hungering for righteousness, being merciful, being pure, being a peacemaker. All of those things are how we live, how we need to live in this world that is lacking in all of those things. And lastly, on the list, we saw being persecuted for being righteous, and that should be something we expect. We're so blessed in this country right now that we don't receive that persecution, but there are lots of other countries where Christians are persecuted, and that may come here too. And so that is really a thing that we've escaped, but we may not always. So these whole Beatitudes together for Christians is saying that sometimes there's going to be situations like this that are just going to happen to you. Being pure or mourning, those are things that can just happen without anybody doing anything. But some of them are going to be the result of people in the world intentionally mistreating you. And that's really what the final Beatitude was saying. When people lie about you and say bad things about you and call you all sorts of names, that is intentional, and you may see that as well. So you can be in these situations just because it happened, or sometimes people will put you in these situations intentionally trying to be mean to you. And we should expect that. All of this is about, this is the life we live in the bodies that we have in this physical world. And so finally, the ultimate message of the Beatitudes is don't worry about these situations. They're going to happen, expect them to happen. But there is a future spiritual world where you will be rich, you will be comforted, righteous, all those things that were the blessings that were promised for all of those Beatitudes. Oh, and I have a closing verse. I forgot about that. So this comes from later on in Matthew chapter 25. Then the king will say to those who are at his right, come, blessed ones of my Father, inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you from the foundation of the universe. For I was hungry, and you gave me food, and I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Any questions, thoughts?
I think this is when the apostles actually asked Jesus, when did we do that for you? And he said, well, if you did it for someone else, you did it for me. And that's really the bottom line there. We serve God through other people. And that's the most important thing that we can do in this world. Besides that, getting saved and accepting the Lord,